Okay, let's unpack this. When most of us learned about the independence movements that swept across South America in the early 1800s, the narrative is, well, it's epic. It's all about Bolivar's grand vision, San Martin crossing the Andes, a purely local struggle, driven by Creole ideology against the Spanish crown. It's a clean, compelling story.
It is. And while those men and their armies certainly fought and bled for that independence, that traditional narrative, it leaves out a huge piece of the puzzle. It omits the single most powerful, strategic, and frankly, essential player in the entire conflict.
The one that provided the gunpowder, the ships, the strategy, and the money.
We're talking about Great Britain.
Exactly. Our deep dive today is pulling back that curtain on the massive, calculated, and often untold role of the British Empire in liberating Gran Colombia, Chile, and Peru. And this wasn't some mission of shared democratic ideals, not at all. It was maybe the most successful commercial intervention in 19th century history. So our mission is to reveal the specific, non-altruistic reasons behind this British support and just the sheer industrial scale of it.
And you realize just how calculated it all was when you look at the source material. For instance, that iconic military feat San Martin's crossing of the Andes to liberate Chile and Peru, that wasn't some spur-of-the-moment decision.
Right.
Our sources show it was originally conceived as a detailed British military plan, designed specifically to dismantle the last royalist strongholds. San Martin simply executed the blueprint.
And here's where it gets really interesting for me. We're not talking about, clandestine special ops. The sources confirm that lists of unemployed Napoleonic War veterans were being openly recruited right out of British pubs, advertised in London newspapers, all to board ships bound for South America. They even called themselves the British Legions.
It was industrial-scale hiring for a revolution, all happening under the guise of private enterprise.
Wow.
It was a conflict driven almost exclusively by economics. So to really get this, we have to set the stage. This was Britain fighting to break a rigid Spanish commercial monopoly, period. Any shared passion for revolutionary ideology it was secondary, if it existed at all.
That commercial imperative brings us right to the global economic scene back then. Early 1800s. Great Britain was so far ahead of the curve, they were the cradle of the Industrial Revolution, churning out textiles, manufactured goods.
And weapons. Crucially for a war, weapons on a scale the world had never seen.
But they had a problem.
A huge problem. They desperately needed expanding global markets to absorb all this production, but their path into the most lucrative colonial market, Spanish America, was completely blocked. Spain had the strict mercantile monopoly. Colonies could only trade with the mother country.
So Spain was the absolute buyer and the absolute seller.
Exactly. And that system just throttled British industrial capacity.
It's the ultimate trade barrier. So Britain's foreign policy toward South America coalesced around a simple, powerful concept, what historians later called the imperialism of free trade.
That's it. The goal was just to dismantle the entire Spanish mercantilist system and replace it with open markets that were perfectly tailored to British industrial output and, of course, their financial dominance.
And to do that, they had to understand the system they were disrupting.
Right, because Spain's control wasn't as centrally monolithic as you might think. Over centuries, the system had evolved. It allowed local colonial elites, the wealthy Creoles in places like Lima, Mexico City, and Buenos Aires, a lot of control.
Yeah.
They controlled income collection, taxes, local spending.
So those local elites had a deep financial stake in keeping things the way they were, even if they didn't like Spanish political rule.
Precisely. Their wealth depended on that local control. So the British strategy wasn't just about, blowing up the Spanish government. It was about disrupting that local financial structure by offering the Creole elites something truly irresistible.
Which way?
Direct, tax-free, lucrative access to the world's leading market and financial system. Why buy expensive, heavily taxed cloth shipped all the way through Spain when you could get cheaper, better British goods directly?
It's a no-brainer. And the perfect window for this whole economic strategy just blows wide open in 1808.
And the man responsible for handing Britain this golden opportunity was Napoleon Bonaparte. His invasion of Spain, putting his brother on the Spanish throne. It caused a total crisis of authority. Loyalty to the crown just vanished, and the metropolis's control over its American colonies dissolved.
This created the power vacuum, the one that allowed these autonomous governments, these juntas, to pop up in America, claiming to rule in the name of the imprisoned Spanish king. It was chaos, and Britain loves chaos when it means open markets.
But this wasn't Britain's first attempt to seize those markets, and that history is crucial.
Right. Before they landed on this indirect proxy strategy, they tried direct conquest.
They did.
I'm talking about those pretty embarrassing military adventures in 1806 and 1807.
Absolutely. The British military tried a direct takeover of the Rio de la Plata region. We're talking around 14,000 men occupying Buenos Aires and Montevideo. They thought the colonies would welcome them as liberators from Spain.
But they were defeated, and not by the professional Spanish army.
No, the Spanish army was busy with Napoleon. They were defeated and forced to capitulate by local militias, composed of Creoles and indigenous peoples.
And that's the crucial turning point in British policy.
It is. Those defeats confirmed two things. First, that direct conquest of South America was just prohibitively expensive and politically a nightmare. And second, maybe more importantly, it injected this immense self-confidence into the colonial population. I mean, they had just defeated the world's most powerful military force with their own resources. That realization is what really lit the fire for independence.
So Britain learned its lesson. The cost of doing it themselves was too high. They pivot, shift from direct invasion to this indirect support using proxies and private commercial interests. They maintain official government neutrality while the gears of revolution are privately lubricated by British finance.
And we should note one big exception here, Brazil. When Napoleon moved on Portugal, the entire Portuguese court just fled. They went directly to Rio de Janeiro. So Brazil didn't have a revolutionary independence struggle. Instead, the colony was later granted independence by its own king, Pedro I, with direct, immediate British diplomatic support in 1822.
Just to secure those vital trade agreements without a fight.
Simple as that.
But for the rest of Spanish America, the support came from the shadows. So let's get into the mechanics of that. Who were the proxies making this happen?
Well, they were speculators, adventurous merchants, financial institutions, and that mass of unemployed veterans we mentioned. In the power vacuum left by Spain, these private contacts just flourished. They recognized that if they armed the revolutionaries, the new independent state would owe them its existence, and that would guarantee them preferential trade status.
And since Britain was the only country with real industrial muscle, the material support was just staggering. How did they pull this off while keeping up the pretense of neutrality? I mean, that seems impossible to hide.
It wasn't entirely hidden, but it was easily dismissed as private enterprise. Britain didn't send Royal Navy ships loaded with cannons. Instead, they allowed private merchants to set up these war supply chains. These merchants took contracts from agents like Luis Lopez Mendez. Simon Bolivar specifically named him in 1817 as the official representative of the Third Republic of Venezuela in London.
So Mendez was basically an arms dealer with a diplomatic title, negotiating for industrial output.
Exactly. And the numbers, they really reveal the result. The sources detail the scale of what was shipped, over 700,000 muskets.
700,000. That's not just helping out. That's equipping an entire war.
Oh, and that's just the muskets. Then you have over 100,000 pistols, more than 4,500 tons of cannon and musket balls, and over 10,000 cannons.
That's a modern army's worth of equipment.
Yeah.
That level of armament fundamentally changed things. The revolutionary forces stopped being small guerrilla groups and became professional, organized armies that could actually hold their own in long campaigns.
And that material support was one critical pillar. The second was financial assistance. Once independence was on the horizon, the new governments needed money. Immediately. To pay their armies, set up governments, and most importantly, to start trade. So they turned to the London financial markets.
And this is where the long-term dependency really kicks in.
It does. Between 1822 and 1825, new governments, we're talking Gran Colombia, Chile, Peru, Buenos Aires, Brazil, Mexico, they all accessed the London markets. They issued government bonds valued at roughly 21 million.
21 million pounds in the 1820s. That must have been an astronomical sum.
Right.
What kind of burden did that put on these brand new nations?
I think it was crushing, and it cemented the mechanism of dependence. These loans were often secured by future customs revenues issued at high interest rates. The new nations basically started their lives in massive debt to the English financial system, the Wall Street of the 19th century. They had to keep their ports open to British trade just to service the debt.
So they just swapped the Spanish mercantile monopoly for a British financial one right out of the gate. That's a powerful move. Okay, let's shift to the muscle. Because this wasn't just about money and metal, it was about the people.
Yes, the British legions. We're talking about approximately 7,000 volunteers, Overwhelmingly Irish and British veterans who were unemployed after the Napoleonic Wars. They were mercenaries attracted by pay, promises of land, and they formed the shock troops for Bolivar's most critical campaigns in Gran Colombia.
Sounds like a pretty tough deployment.
Brutal. The sources are clear on the risks. 220 drowned just on the way over. Many others died from tropical diseases before they even saw battle. But for those who survived, their professionalism was just unmatched.
And their contribution secured crucial, defining victories.
Absolutely decisive. They were essential at the Battle of Vargas in 1819, which allowed Bolivar to press on to Boyaca later that year and cement Colombia's independence. Then 2 years later, at the Battle of Carabobo, the final push, led by Colonel Thomas Hilderton Ferrier, secured Venezuelan independence. And many of these veterans just stayed. They integrated into the new societies.
And you can't talk about the military pillar without the naval one. I mean, it's hard to win a coastal war without controlling the sea.
Indeed. Naval superiority was Britain's signature strength. And that brings us to Lord Cochrane, a volatile but brilliant former British Navy captain. He was hired to organize and command first the Chilean Navy and then later the Brazilian Navy.
Why was he so crucial? It wasn't just about protecting a coastline, was it?
No, it was about isolating the royalist capital of Lima. Cochrane achieved absolute naval supremacy in the Pacific. This was vital because it allowed San Martin to move his armies by sea, securing supply lines, isolating the royalist strongholds in Peru. The campaign would have been impossible without him.
And his most celebrated achievement was that spectacular night raid, right? The capture of the Spanish frigate Esmeralda in 1820.
Right, in the heavily defended port of El Callao, Peru. It was a massive psychological and military blow. And this continued until the very end. British and Irish officers like William Miller fought in the final campaigns in Peru, culminating in the Battle of Ayacucho, which effectively ended Spanish rule in South America.
Which moves us to the final piece of the strategy, the diplomatic game. Britain spent a decade using proxies and private interests, but after 1820, the official government had to step in.
This shift was driven by a very real geopolitical fear. The conservative reaction in Europe, the Holy Alliance, Russia, Prussia, Austria, Spain, they were dedicated to the divine right of monarchs. They were terrified the Republican experiments in South America would spread, and there was a real concern they might intervene militarily to reinstall the Spanish monarchy.
An intervention that would, of course, instantly shut down all those newly established British trade routes.
Exactly. Britain could not allow its primary commercial objective to be undone by its continental rivals. The mastermind behind the diplomatic strategy to neutralize this threat was the British Foreign Minister, George Canning.
And Canning recognized that formal recognition was the only way to politically secure Britain's commercial position against the European monarchies.
He did. So in 1823, Canning made the landmark decision to formally recognize the South American states and started sending consuls. This was the ultimate political payoff. It streamlined trade agreements instantly, a direct challenge to the Holy Alliance.
His famous quote sums it all up, doesn't it? "I made the new world to restore the balance of the old." He used South American independence as this huge lever to counter European conservatism.
And we have to briefly mention the Monroe Doctrine here. The U.S. had started recognizing these states in 1822. Canning actually proposed an alliance to the U.S. to jointly resist the Holy Alliance, which is what catalyzed the U.S. declaration of its famous America for the Americans doctrine. The U.S. was, in effect, following Britain's lead.
The outcome was a total, overwhelming victory for British strategy. By 1825, Britain formally recognized Argentina, Colombia, Mexico, and Brazil, decades before Spain did. Britain achieved commercial dominance without moving a single ship of the Royal Navy or firing a single shot.
Exactly. The cost of the revolution, the debt, the political instability, that was all borne by the newly independent nations and the proxies. Britain, however, successfully established its doctrine of the informal empire, an imperialism of free trade that guaranteed its long-term objectives.
But this freedom came at a tremendous economic cost that really defined the region for the next century. Political independence was secured, but the new republics inherited a deeply problematic economic trajectory that the British system just perpetuated.
The first lingering problem was that crushing financial dependence. That initial 21 million debt, it ballooned, reaching an astonishing 1,180 million in British investment by the eve of World War I. It created this lasting reliance on the English financial system just to stay afloat.
And secondly, the economic structure didn't really change. The new nations inherited the Spanish extractive model. Wealth stayed concentrated in the hands of a local landowning elite. And because they owed so much debt and hard currency to London, the new governments were basically forced to double down on extractive, commodity-based exports: silver, nitrates, cotton.
Just to generate the cash to service those loans. This meant the old elite structure, whose wealth came from extraction and land, was locked into power. They became the powerful regional leaders, the caudillos, whose internal conflicts plagued the region for decades. So the British support secured political independence, but it really failed to break the structural economic issues inherited from Spain.
Which brings us to our final provocative thought for you. The British played the geopolitical chessboard brilliantly to secure trade and end the old monarchy. But did this external support, by locking the new republics into this external financial reliance and forcing them to prioritize extractive economies to pay their debts, did it fundamentally condemn the region to a future of political instability and economic inequality? What stands out to you as the greatest long-term consequence of this 19th century geopolitical game?